So today on the Observing Fullerton podcast, we are interviewing Judith Kaluzny. Judith has practiced family law in Fullerton from 1976 till 2020. She is a staff writer for the Fullerton Observer and had roots in journalism earlier in her career in Wisconsin. Recently, Judith has released a marriage license handbook that is a comprehensive guide on what marriage is legally, what consequences might occur from the current laws on marriage and divorce, and how to prepare yourself better as a couple before you tie the knot. Our interview today with Judith will focus on her career as a lawyer, as a mediator, a journalist, and a writer. All right, so let's get right into the questions. So you were a housewife for 17 years and you have 7 kids, right?
Yes.
What made you transition to going to law school in 1973?
Oh, the fact that my then husband filed for divorce.
Uh-oh.
And I, at that time, my children were going to community open school, and we had a carpool. And one of my carpool pals was a lawyer. Mm-hmm. And I had not ever had a full-time job. And I did not have a college degree. So I said, Anita, what am I going to do? And she said, you can go to law school. And I said, without a degree? She said, sure, go to Western State. And I thought, okay. I had looked into going to a 4-year college, but the only thing I was interested in was journalism. And the guidance counselor said, no jobs, no money in journalism. And I would have had to go at least 2 years anyway. So I thought 3 years, I'll have a doctor's degree, a doctor of jurisprudence. Plus, when going through court, my husband's lawyer brought up the fact that I had applied for law school. And so the judge says, well, it's admirable of you to want to better yourself, but there's not enough money to go around, so you have to go to work. And I thought, what am I doing now? With 7 children, that wasn't counted as work. In any case, so I went to law school full-time and got through it. And I started in family law because those were the people who called me. A lot of women at that time were looking for women lawyers. So I did a few other cases early on, but I finally just concentrated on family law, and those were the clients that came to me.
So it was more by the demand that was there at that time?
Yes.
So what got you interested in mediation?
A woman I knew who was an expert in domestic violence. She got her PhD writing a dissertation on domestic violence, but she was a sociologist, and there's no money as a sociologist unless you're a professor. So she took a class in mediation, and she asked me to be her attorney consultant. And so it was so interesting. I finally just sat in on the whole mediation sessions with her, and then I started taking mediation training. And after a time, family law is so disastrous. I just gave up litigation and did only family law mediation.
So you've been doing that. You did that from late 1970s?
I think 1986 is when I started with mediation.
And you did that until 2020?
Yes.
That's a very long career in mediation.
Yes. Well, I didn't quit the litigation instantly, but by the mid-90s, I would say I had given up the litigation.
Right. So all of this experience from litigation and mediation kind of culminated itself into this book, right?
Yes.
So the Marriage License Handbook, it covers how you can be best prepared legally before getting married.
Yes.
And becoming more informed about the laws in California that can affect you. What is your hope for a handbook like this? Like, how can couples use this in the best way?
Well, they could use it for discussions to more explore their relationship before they fall into any disasters in marriage. For example, what about debts? Are you going to live on a budget? Well, those are some of the things to think about when you're doing I suggest strongly premarital agreements, because it's not just about money, like if one has a lot of money and the other doesn't. That's what people think of when they think of prenups. But that's not the total picture. And I believe that if people sit down and have talks about these kinds of lifetime issues, What are your goals in life? They'll get to know each other a little more, and maybe before they tie the knot, they'll find out the things that they don't like, and they will find out that marriage is not a good idea. So it's and if it goes well, then they will have a better, more solid marriage. Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes I've done mediation to stay married. Mm-hmm. And one case was a couple that husband loved his wife dearly, but she had become a spendthrift, and he was really nervous about debts she would run up. And so we worked out an arrangement for them to separate their finances so that he would not be responsible for her debts, even though they were still married. So there's a California law, well, let's put it this way, as one writer said, there's a prenup that the state provides for you if you don't write your own. Mm-hmm. So you can change the state law by writing an agreement, signing it, dating it. Mm-hmm. You don't necessarily have to have it notarized, but in writing, you can change what the state law provides.
And you can set your own rules in your marriage?
Yes. Another couple, this was a prenuptial mediation. Mm-hmm. And they were concerned because they were going to be living with wife's parents. She was already living with them. Mm-hmm. And she was paying the mortgage as rent to her parents. Now, when they got married, her earnings would be community property. Mm-hmm. Therefore, if she used her community property earnings to make payments on the house, that would give the house a community interest. Mm-hmm. And they both agreed that they did not want to get a community interest in her parents' house. Mm-hmm. So we did an agreement to make that happen.
Right, so these are some of the cases. Well, one of them was after getting married and one of them was before, so that means you can write an agreement after you've gotten married as well?
Yes. I had a client for divorce one time, a businesswoman. She had a very successful business. Mm-hmm. She had established 11 years before. And she said she had consulted with a lawyer because when she was starting the business, because she had wanted that to be her separate property. The lawyer said, "Oh, no, it has to be community property." Bad advice. Mm-hmm. She and her husband could have had a written agreement that her business would be her sole and separate property no matter what. So had she known this before that got to divorce part, they could have changed it during the marriage. Right. You can write postnups as well as prenups.
Right, and this book kind of has all of that information in it in a very easy-to-read manner. You can read the whole thing in less than an hour. Yes,
one woman said to me, "Oh, this is so handy, you can carry it in your purse."
Exactly.
I took a booth at a marriage expo, a wedding expo, and some of the women came with their mothers, and one mother grabbed the book and said, "I'm going to get this for my daughter." Mm-hmm. And somebody else said, "Oh, this would be a great shower gift."
Right. So while we're on the topic of wedding expos, people intending to get married are very focused on parties, celebrations, the planning side of the wedding itself. It's a very lucrative industry, but according to the handbook, when I was reading it, I realized that you kind of emphasized that there are more important things that people need to prepare for when they get married.
Yes.
What are some of the most common issues that can arise legally when couples are trying to either divorce or nullify their marriage, or they have children and then they're separating? What are some of the common things you see?
Well, first of all, the state of California sets people up for hostility in a divorce. And if they're used to negotiating and bargaining with things, and I think the handbook gets a couple into the mood for discussions and being free and open with each other. A divorce is just another form of a contract. However, it's also like a wedding, it's lucrative. So, for other people.
Right.
And so I think the handbook will highlight issues so you're clear on whose property is what, so you don't have to go into fighting about this is my separate property. You will, I mean, like some of the issues are husband owned a house before they got married, and 20 years later they're getting a divorce. Meantime, the house has got a community interest because the payments have been made with community earnings. So the question is, how much is he entitled to as his separate property before marriage? So if you didn't establish that at the time you got married, what the house was worth, then you're going to spend a lot of money with appraisers who have to figure out what it was worth 20 years ago. Right. And because when you do own a piece of separate property when you get married, for instance, a house, or money that you put as a down payment on a house that you buy jointly, you're entitled to get that back in a divorce. So if you know that ahead of time, you can make plans. Even though you stay together, at least you'll feel comfortable knowing what the basis of your relationship is financially.
Right, and that financial aspect can really also ruin a marriage. So I think if you know in the beginning, you get this handbook or you just have that discussion.
Yes, I think I've read that money is the main problem in marriages. Mm-hmm. Disagreements over money.
Wow. So if you get that figured out by writing an agreement beforehand,
yes,
then that you can avoid a lot of those problems.
Like, do you want to live on a budget? You know, who's going to take care of paying the bills?
Right.
I can remember during my marriage, my husband was paying the bills, and he was this kind of person that just got into a horrible state of rage and anger in paying people money. And so there he'd be sitting there, you know, cursing and suffering, and I just got so fed up with that. I said, give me the bills, let me write them. I couldn't stand the emotional aspect of it. So who's going to pay the bills? Mm-hmm. Of course, I always think that you should include who's going to clean the toilets, but I don't think if you had a prenup that had that in there, a judge would look kindly on that.
But basically what you're saying is you need to have those conversations before and get everything figured out.
Yes.
Before you enter that contract.
For example, religion. I mean, not just the financial aspects, but is religion important to you?
Right.
Or are you willing to talk about sex? You know, is that a subject you can talk about? What about children? Do you want to have children? If you have children, what are your attitudes on raising children? All those suggestions and lists are in the handbook, as well as the financial legal aspects of it.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the handbook is a very comprehensive guide. And you've done a really good job writing it, by the way.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So you've had this kind of career as a lawyer and a mediator, but then you kind of stepped back into, while you were still a lawyer, into journalism with the Observer.
Well, the two are very similar. Mm-hmm. What I learned in journalism school was at Marquette University. I never graduated, but I learned a lot. Was that you don't have to know but 5% of everything. Mm-hmm. You have to know how to find out the other 95%. And law is the same way. You just have to know, 5% of it, but where to find out the rest of it. That's what legal research is all about. Mm-hmm. So I find them similar in those ways.
Right. So doing journalism and law together, did that ever present some sort of a conflict to you between the two fields, or do you think they complement each other really well?
No, they're both about writing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, lawyers do a lot of writing.
Right. And journalists.
I did an awful lot of domestic violence cases. Well, actually, while I was still in law school, I was on the board of directors of the third shelter for battered women in this country. It was also the third in California. So a lot of battered women were my clients. Mm-hmm. And I would write declarations for them in order for them to get to go to a judge to get restraining orders. And women would say, wow, you write it as if you were right there. Oh. So being a good writer is good for both journalism and law.
Right.
Especially family law.
Yeah. And you definitely do a good job at that as well.
And I was not a full-time journalist while I was lawyering.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I would write articles that came to my attention, especially since I lived in downtown Fullerton. I wrote a lot of articles about downtown Fullerton because I was here.
So briefly in the handbook, one thing that I noticed was that you mentioned your ultimate goal of overthrowing the family law system.
Yes.
Could you explain that?
Well, I think that the family law system as it exists in California is a fraud on the public.
Mm-hmm.
For one thing, when we got no-fault divorce back in the 70s, the Family Law Commission appointed by Governor Brown I said, we want this to be a non-adversary process. So it was taken out of the civil law and made into a special branch called family law.
Mm-hmm.
So now there's family law, civil law, and criminal law.
Mm-hmm.
And except that when you file for divorce, you fill out a petition and you sign the petition. And there's a summons that goes with the petition. And it's not called plaintiff and defendant. Now it's called petitioner and respondent.
Okay.
It's supposed to sound more nicer.
Mm-hmm.
And except that at the top of the summons, it says to the respondent, and then the name is typed in. And then there's a black box right under that person's name that says, you have been sued. And this is hardly the start of a non-adversary process.
So on a divorce petition, it says you have been sued?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. You know, what anybody's idea of non-adversary includes that, I don't know. In any case, and the other amazing statistic, the Judicial Council are the people that run the courts of California. Mm-hmm. And they report statistics. And I was reading their statistics a year or two ago, and I saw that they noted that 365,000 divorces had been completed in the state of California that year. Mm-hmm. And out of those 365,000, 1,300 and some were concluded with a trial in front of a judge. Mm-hmm. That's fewer than 1% of the people have a judge decide their divorce. The process grinds people down that they are kind of coerced into settlements before their case gets to court. And the other thing the Judicial Council did was they did a survey one year on what the citizens expect or want from their courts. They did a survey in regard to civil courts and criminal and small claims and family law. The people responding to family law said they want a chance to tell their story and they want a fair process. Mm-hmm. And they don't get either one. They do not get either one.
How so? Could you describe that a bit more in detail?
Well, if to tell your story, you tell it to your lawyer, and you pay him or her for their time in listening. And then they tell it to the other lawyer. That's another cost. The judge doesn't want to hear it. The other part is the fair process. Mm-hmm. I had a young man working for me that was going through divorce. He and his wife had 3 children, and they had been amicable enough, except her parents hired a lawyer for her, and the lawyer made this into controversy. So on the 5th time that he went to court just to get a parenting plan, he was so exhausted with 4 continuances. Can you imagine what your life is like? Let's say you have a job, you have a 3-month-old baby, and you go to court for your case after having the anxiety and a sleepless night, and it's continued. So you have to go through that another time. Suppose you have to take off time from work, 5 times just to get a parenting plan in place. And anyway, so the 5th time he sort of gave up and took what the judge handed out. And I said, don't worry, Juan, there's always the trial. And he says, what? You mean there's more? And then you go through the same process with the trial. Or another thing is that the courts have so many cases that I counted up one time the hours that a judge has and the cases that he had on his calendar, and it was like at the maximum 18 minutes per case. Well, so that's where the continuances come in. The judge doesn't have time to deal with all of that. Or the judge will say to the lawyers, well, tell me, counsel, what's this all about? Lawyer 1 says blah, blah, blah. Lawyer 2 says blah, blah, blah. And the judge says, well, if you were to put it on, in other words, give evidence, I'd probably decide blah, blah, blah. So go out in the hallway and write it up.
Okay.
And so I had one woman that I helped do an appeal one time a little bit. And she went through that. Her lawyer and her husband and the husband's lawyer went in the conference room, left her in the hallway. They wrote up an agreement, and her lawyer says, "Here, sign." And it required her to refinance the house. And she said, "I can't do that. I can't afford those kinds of payments." And the lawyer says, "Look, it's 4:00. The court is closing, and just sign it." And she was coerced into signing it. And so she was compelled to refinance the house. The lawyer for his attorney's fees had a lien on the house, so he got $11,000 off the top, and then he quit her case. And she ultimately lost the house. Wow. So, it's not a fair process. And so people think when you sign up for a legal process, you're going to have your day in court, and you don't in family law, which is especially cruel because it's so hard on children. There's one judge, Judge Bells, that gave a talk to the family law bar, and he gave a talk to the probate bar, which does guardianships of children. And he told about the psychological harm to young children. That stress at an early age can cause permanent brain damage and can inhibit a child's growth. So he was advocating that we lawyers should take care to not cause people stress. Well, that's not possible. That's wishful thinking. And so I can tell you, everybody agrees that the process is terrible and causes harm, and nobody will do a thing to change it. So anyway, it just...
So that's why you want to overthrow the entire family law system.
Let's make it a reasonable process.
And what would that look like?
I said people would if you go to an office where it's full service family law service, and you want to sign up to get a divorce, the first thing that will be determined is, do you have children? Okay, if you have children, do you already have a parenting plan? No, you don't? Okay, here's our mediation department, and you guys come in here and work out a parenting plan first thing. And then, do you have property? Do you know the values of everything? Do you need help to establish values? Okay, we have appraisers on staff that, you'll have to pay the appraisers, of course, but you only need one instead of husband hiring one and wife hiring one, and then the appraisers fight it out in court. I had an appraiser one time that was working for mediation clients of mine. They wanted to value their business. So they hired one appraiser so they could agree on the division of property. And this man was telling me stories of a big case that he had where his fees amounted to $100,000. And he says, but he didn't do the main part of the work. The husband's lawyer actually did the main work, and his fees were $300,000. Wow. So in my process, you would initiate divorce with kind of, I would call it a triage process. What do you need to help you divide up your property and have parenting plans and figure out what kind of support is needed for the kids or for the spouse who was a stay-at-home parent. Oh, that's another thing, Arush, you could think of in your premarital plan. If one person, if you have kids, is going to stay home to take care of the kids, then how will you compensate that person for being out of the workforce for a period of time?
Right.
And then if community money is spent on books and fees and tuition, should it come to that, how will the community be compensated for this education that one person will take away from the marriage?
So you are currently working on a personal history and a history of Fullerton. So what
Yes.
can we expect from those works?
My history of Fullerton is more of a personal history, too. I've been here in Fullerton since 1965. And somehow I got involved in political kinds of things. I think it was because I was looking for something to do. Back in Wisconsin, I had been involved with the Democratic Party. But in California, politics was bizarre. And, I mean, there was more than one Democratic Party. There was more than one Republican Party. And I could see right away you had to have a lot of money or a lot of time. So my start was I got involved with Fair Housing Council. And then I got involved with the PTA, and we fought City Hall with a road through the regional park. And then I got involved with some women's things, and that's how I got onto the board of directors of the Shelter for Battered Women. So, and then downtown, I'm living downtown, so I got involved in a lot of the downtown issues.
Right.
So my history will not be about old men with beards that establish railroads.
Right. It will be a holistic history of Fullerton.
Yes, with a lot of
personal
work
take
by
on
the
it.
women.
Right.
And then my personal history, it's like I'm a storyteller, and I figured I might as well put these stories down, and then I don't have to be telling them to people. I can just say, well, if you want to know, just read the book.
So any idea on the timeline of when we can expect these books?
No, I guess I need a little incentive or a little somebody saying, when, thank you.
No problem. Then we have it on record.
Yes,
you know?
now it'll be sooner.
Right. So who else do you think we should be interviewing on this podcast?
Oh, definitely Jane Reifer. Jane Reifer knows so much history of Fullerton. I mean, she knows the historic buildings, and she knows what became of some of them. And even especially, she knows the murals of Fullerton. Once for a birthday party I had where my whole family came from all over the world. I got 2 kids in Germany and 1 in South America. Anyway, so they were all here, and one of the things we did is Jane gave us a mural tour.
Wow.
And she got us into the cellar of an apartment house where there used to be a speakeasy, and there's a fragment of a mural left there. So she knows history of Fullerton from the ground up. And anyway, very interesting person. And then another one is Carolyn Dreif, who is a Fullerton person who has taught school and lived for years in different countries. She lived in China and taught English, and she's lived in South America and taught English. So it's like, and I don't know where else and how many languages she speaks, but her experience in living overseas for years in foreign countries, I think would be interesting.
Right. Those are great recommendations. Thank you. We'll have
You're
them
welcome.
down and try our best to contact them. So thank you so much, Judith, for being on the podcast today.
Oh, this was nice.
Yeah, it was a great interview, and I think your
Thank you.
handbook is one of the most useful resources for any couples who are
Good,
looking to get
good.
married. So thank you again for your time, your knowledge, and your experience. And
You're
I'm
welcome.
going to be looking forward to those 2 books.
Oh, well, then can I do another podcast?
Sure. Every time there's another release, we'll do another
All right.
podcast.
All right, one for each book. Thank you.
No problem.
Bye.
Bye-bye.